All right, welcome back, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. We've got Christian Dorr and Chris Oosthoek. They're going to join us now. One of the things that I like, another benefit of the remote summit this year, we've had more of our European friends speak than we've ever had in the history of the summit. So I really enjoy us getting to diversify what we got going on. Chris and Christian have done some research. They're going to go through some of the pitfalls that they've observed in their research and then give us some suggestions. So gentlemen, please take it away.
Yeah, so thank you for attending our talk. In this talk, we will discuss several challenges we really discovered in the CTI field, as well as their potential solutions. The discussion is structured after one of our lab's many papers on CTI, and this one was published in the International Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence. In the first part of this presentation, we will take more of a red team perspective towards CTI. We think this is not only a useful way to improve your organization's security posture, but also to improve as a field. And in the second part of this presentation, we'll take then the blue team perspective, discussing potential avenues of improvement to work on as a community. So first, a short bit about ourselves. My name is Chris Oosthoek. I'm a senior threat analyst at Rijkswaterstaat in the Netherlands. And in the Rijkswaterstaat SOC, we are responsible for security monitoring, as well as response and CTI on the public works, such as bridges, dams, road and waterways. And I'm also a part-time PhD student with the Cyber Threat Intelligence Lab, where I try to bridge CTI practice with academia. In this talk, I will take a practitioner perspective towards CTI.
My name is Christian Dorr. I'm professor for cybersecurity and enterprise security, and I lead the Cyber Threat Intelligence Lab at the Hasso-Plattner Institute for Digital Engineering near Berlin in Germany. In the lab, we do a variety of research around CTI. We do investigations into cyber criminal groups, we observe them, we study their methods, but we also develop methodology on how we can improve and augment CTI. And finally, we do research how to integrate cybersecurity knowledge efficiently into organizations. I will be taking the academic perspective in this talk and talk about what we know based on published empirical research about CTI practice.
So, CTI is still a relatively young field in the history of computing, really, but we have already come a long way. Several events have led to a greater maturity of our field, which we'll shortly discuss here. We will refer to them as pivot points, as each of these events symbolize the development into our field into what it is today. So first, the blockbuster AP21 report by Mandiant, which you'll all know. This was one of the first significant reports from a commercial source with a very thorough analysis of a Chinese military unit's TTPs. This report set the stage for all other vendor reports to come, indicating to vendors that in order to gain a certain street cred, this was the type of analysis that you really need to do. It was also significant because it significantly raised the bar on the technical analysis required. Therefore, we refer to this report as a technical pivot point for CTI. And then only a few years later, it was really Bellingcat who illustrated with their MH17 and Skripal poisonings report that now also basically every citizen with an internet connection can do CTI analysis. This has not only led to a huge influx of people into CTI, but also Bellingcat has really crowdsourced and democratized intelligence analysis. And therefore, we refer to this as CTI's societal pivot point. And now CTI is also regarded as mature by leaders in order that its results really serve as input to important policy decisions. A recent example of this is really the EU cyber diplomacy toolbox. Through this, all EU member states jointly call the bluff of malicious state actors if one member gets attacked, of which you see an example on the screen. So this is all great, but what now? Is this really it? If we would look at future pivot points, what do we need to do? And in order to get there, what would we need to fix first?
So we have come a long way as a community and we are creating great impact as a community, but there is room for other improvement. This essentially evolves around methodology. So over the next 25 minutes, we will discuss 6 challenges the CTI field, in our opinion, currently faces, based on our own observations, as well as works on CTI by others. So these are the challenges we're going to discuss. First, we believe the CTI field is currently lacking accurate methodology for analysis, collection, and interpretation of our data. Second, many of our input data, but also our output, is of a low quality, and we have to understand where it comes from and correct this. Third, CTI is shared, but hardly being used by its recipients for several reasons. Fourth, we live in a filter bubble and much of our CTI information is biased. We have to account for this. Fifth, the CTI supply chain, especially from commercial vendors, is intransparent, and this makes analysis harder than it should be. And finally, sixth, attribution and tracing of developments has become overly complicated. And because of this, as practitioners, we believe CTI currently fails to deliver on the value it could potentially have to the broader cybersecurity field.
So for the discussion of our first challenge, some personal background. When I started in CTI, I came to the field with a huge interest in methodology. I was tasked writing the CTI charter for Rijkswaterstaat SOC. So I was really curious to know whether any standard methods existed. Of course, if you work in a highly talented team, you want to build on your teams and your colleagues' expertise. But as you know, people come and go, so critical activities such as CTI analysis to some extent need to be standardized in order to ensure continuity. So I asked around with colleagues, industry experts, and of course I also attended several conferences and training. But I really didn't find any methodology, or to be more specific, I didn't find something that would fly as methodology in other fields, like medicine, for example. So yes, I found separate models and frameworks like the kill chain and later also attack. That we, of course, somehow weave together in our analysis with a magic wand sometimes. But is that truly methodology? I would like to argue here it mostly isn't. Because methodology would really ensure that one person new into your team roughly comes to the same conclusions as someone who has been there for a bit longer. And call me an idealist, but I think this is what I still want for CTI. Now, as an industry, we have of course come up with some very useful frameworks, especially attack has contributed hugely to how we discuss TTPs. But doing that, it has really standardized our discussion and not our analysis. It's a taxonomy and not a methodology. So it doesn't lead you from data to intelligence, just as it doesn't lead you from indicators to facts empirically. And I believe that because of us lacking methodology, much of our analysis has still too much room for interpretation currently. So then I agree that CTI analysis might be more of an art than a science, and therefore differences on a per case basis might exist. But one of my future projects would here really be to work on developing CTI playbooks and open sourcing these. Because I think this would really benefit how we go about assessing third-party analysis, because it provides you insight into subtle nuances that might or might not apply to your particular threat environment and IT asset landscape. So that's one of my hobby horses. But talking about, going about matters empirically, does science provide us any insight here?
So when we talk about CTI methodology, one thing that is always mentioned are SATs. And what we know from research is that SATs can improve your intelligence analysis if you apply them correctly. But we also know that even trained analysts do not always apply them correctly, which decreases output quality. And it is also important to know that even though SATs play a key role in intelligence analysis, there's very little systematic analysis of their use and utility until now. This applies both to academic research, but also in industry. For example, the first paper here from Rand remarks also that in the intelligence community, agencies have not done systematic evaluation of their use and effects. This is clearly a gap we must address because we need to better understand what works in terms of methodology and under which circumstances, and separate this from what does not provide us any returns. Methodology is an important component, and methodology is necessary so that we get in processes consistently good output. And we use the methodology such as SATs in order to avoid introducing a bias in the analysis and to make wrong conclusions. Unfortunately, in practice, it does not work that well consistently. The second paper here studies people who underwent Navy intelligence training and from Naval Command and Control. And although having been trained on SATs, the participants introduced biases for their own assessment conditions, they selected the more supportive evidence in general, they systematically prioritized the most supportive evidence as the most important for their analysis. So part of the problem seems to be that people do not follow methodology well. And in the third paper, the authors observed that even analysts with a formal training at a UK intelligence organization, trained analysts did not follow all of the steps of ACH and follow them correctly, and this led to judgment inconsistency and errors. So, sets are neither a magic bullet nor a guarantee for a solid analysis outcome. But research also shows that they can provide good leverage, and supported through the right process and the right tooling can be made better. For example, there exist studies that show that when analysts work jointly on data and the user face presents all data, either supportive or contradictory to the hypothesis, the analysts do not tend to discard what does not fit their frame of reference, and this makes the analysis outcome more robust. We believe that we as a community should do more research into improving our methodology, understanding what works and why, and move towards universal use best practices. Here, we should all make an impact. Let us look into our CTI successes and failures and investigate if we can find the causes in how we collect and analyze in what was responsible for the issue.
So in 2015, the Bundestag, that is the German parliament, discovered that a malicious actor had breached their Parlecom network. After forensic investigation, the attack was attributed to a Russian state actor group, and reporting was quickly released, as well as several IOCs. One of the IOCs reported that a specific IP was used for command and control. Now then fast forward to 2016, more than 12 months later, the US Democratic National Committee discovered a breach of his network. Now, I guess we're all familiar with the downfall of this attack, also attributed to a Russian state actor. It is, however, less known that just simple alerting on the IP shared by the Bundestag at the time would have resulted in earlier detection. Now, this might be one of those scenarios you are all familiar with. During threat hunting, for example, you observe potentially malicious activity on your network that you could have been, could have discovered earlier had you put this or that detection in place. But there's a subtle difference here. This wasn't an obscure IOC shared in an obscure threat feed. It was an IOC really shared in major blogs, threat reports, and all the CTI feeds. And it was even printed in major international newspapers, this specific IP address. So it was also an artifact that emerged from a breach of a major political target in an allied country and not an insignificant breach of some obscure production facility. So you would say that this is something that most mature CTI teams would have picked up on, but apparently it wasn't recognized by the DNC at the time. Now, this is interesting, right? Because if we look at the pyramid of pain, we categorize IPs at the bottom and we think of them as easy. That is, easy to change by an actor, but also easy to detect. And in this case, the actor didn't even bother to change the IP. Now, of course, the DNC case is only a single case study, which only shows us that there's room for improvement on an individual level. But if we want to improve here as a community, we also need to improve on sharing, which is still a root cause in many CTI failures. So what does academia tell us about this?
Well, academic research shows us that sharing comes at a cost to organizations and individuals. So if you don't set the right incentives and they are mismatched to the outcomes, sharing breaks down. While there's a lot of research in the past into incentives, research specifically into the dynamics and the specifics of the CTI team is still somewhat limited. But what barriers actually exist to intel sharing? The first paper here surveyed 41 organizations in the UK on this. And while organizations saw a wide portfolio of benefits, the top reasons not to share was that the infrastructure for sharing is expensive, there are concerns about the quality and the relevance of the data received, as well as issues around privacy and antitrust concerns. So this is something we can definitely fix. In the second paper, the authors queried some 400 members of a closed group sharing community. And they found that participation in these ISACs is governed by the amount of effort required. So they found that psychologically speaking, participants apply a strict multi-stage decision process. Participants will come into the ISAC if they expect that valuable knowledge will be provided. Okay. If that happens, they also have the expectation that the provided information will be relevant for their specific job task, not just useful for the organization or the community in general. If this has been met, they adapt and reciprocate in order to sustain the activity. So for practitioners, this has implications how you set up your collaboration and sharing communities. If you set up a sharing community, your key focus should be on lowering transaction costs for the exchange. This could, for example, be done, if you combine this with the barriers, by techniques for easy and simplified sharing. You have to realize that people are not altruistic. Surprisingly, the research shows that people mainly care about getting something back for their job, not about improving the community or helping the organization. So think about critical mass, what the focus of the community is, and so that this can be used in order to provide the job-related value to your participants.
So if we want to assess the structural quality of a raw data point in our daily analyses, we normally consider parameters such as origin, timeliness, similarity, and perhaps the false positive ratio of a specific source, right? And from there, we might all have seen that timely data usually also implies a higher false positive ratio. In that sense, we all have developed some kind of gut feeling on how to prioritize raw data from one source versus another. But with regards to this, would there be any peer-reviewed evidence? Does academia provide us with practical insight here for us to how to cut the wheat from the chaff, really?
So in summary, we can say that CTI feeds have serious shortcomings, such as insufficient coverage and timeliness. In academia, there have been a number of studies by now that looked into the quality of the CTI input data, such as indicator feeds. In a paper by our lab, we looked into 24 open feeds, and with the help of a network operator, we could distinguish when a particular malicious activity really started on the internet. And when we looked at 1.5 million indicators around these 24 feeds, and compared to when the activity really started at the network level, we saw that these feeds were neither timely, complete with respect to a particular actor infrastructure, nor particularly precise. So very concretely, we found that on average, it takes 21 days after the start of an activity before it appears on indicator lists. And we also saw that there's drastic collateral damage. For example, in one case, 50% of the worst performing indicators affected more than 100 other domain names as collateral damage. What can we learn from this? While CTI feeds are surely an important element, you cannot rely that by consuming feeds, you will stop issues in time. So feeds are only probably just one small element of an effective CTI practice. Even worse, if you just apply them directly, you risk harming your operation. How is the situation when we look at commercial CTI providers? Commercial CTI is very expensive, but promises high quality data. Unfortunately, here, the research is even scarcer. There's basically only one work from last year that's analyzed commercial CTI. But also here, we can raise questions on quality. In this study, we looked at the resources from leading firms, and when tracking even the same 22 actor groups, there was only between 2.5 and 4% overlap between indicators. But there's a second part to it. When in interviews, practitioners were asked how they use the CTI information, it turns out that false negatives are of a lesser concern. Analysts don't want to be burdened by false positives. And that is interesting because it is one of the goals of CTI to alert us to what we might miss, the unknown unknowns and so on. So if we refer back to the DNC example, this is exactly where it went wrong. Therefore, place a critical view at how you use CTI in your organization and how this can be improved. Especially analyze and understand what is not covered in the data that you currently collect. And also information that is not directly useful for the task at hand, like false positives, provides an important insight into how you can grow as an organization. The quality of our analysis directly depends upon the quality of the data you ingest into your process. You can partially account for this noisy input data if you know about the problems in the data and how to correct for it. The issue is often that we don't know where CTI information comes from. Was it generated by honeypots? Is it human intelligence? Where were the sensors placed? When following CTI feeds, we saw that vendors include data reported in other lists. Now, it becomes difficult to distinguish at this point what is original and unique sightings and not to amplify the importance of certain values unduly. So to support your CTI operation, we recommend to thoroughly investigate where the data comes from. If you know this, you can compensate for data artifacts. If you know the techniques used, you can use this as a confidence estimate for your analysis, but very few report this or tag the source appropriately.
Now, attribution. Of course, this is difficult and challenging. We're not going to argue against that here. But we do think, however, that how we currently go about naming campaigns, actors, as well as intrusion sets only makes it more difficult. Because when we talk about actors, there's really an inflation on naming. Fancy Bear, Sophosy, APT28, Of course, these all refer to the same actor, but also their campaigns and some of their intrusion sets. Now, every CTI vendor uses its own name, also for marketing purposes, which causes a proliferation of names that complicates your analysis only further, as you now also need to keep track of overlaps. So this diffuses the knowledge around threats, and a good example of this is Winty, originally covered in a blog by Daniel Gordon at Risky Biz. In 2012, Winty was first coined as a malware family name by Symantec, and then you see basically that the name is adopted by other vendors to describe groups, as well TTPs, and well, not only do you see something here that would be straight out plagiarism in other industries, every vendor is also applying its own sauce on this, up until the point that the name is so vague that no one really knows what it is anymore, because what they're doing here is, it's being treated more like marketing than research. So then the next challenge. This is a screenshot of the Cyber Operations Tracker, in which the Council of Foreign Relations keeps track of publicly known state-sponsored intrusions, mainly based on government indictments and the bigger vendor reports. While they don't claim that their overview is nearly complete, this map shows nicely how our reporting is biased. You will probably recognize that the bigger vendors where we source most of our reporting from are more inclined to publish on certain threats than others. This is a geographical bias. And from your own analysis, you will hopefully know that there are relevant actor countries that are barely represented on this map. So if you do this, you are at least aware of this bias. However, this geographical bias sometimes is a commercial bias as well. Now, as we will discuss a bit later on in this presentation, it doesn't always have to be bad to have this bias, because a bias might also serve as a deliberate focus. But it is curious, right? So what does empirical data-driven research tell us here? How can we avoid bias in threat feeds?
Indeed, there is bias. Where vendors are located and how they collect the data drastically changes what they report on. If you don't understand or account for this, you will get a biased view of the threat landscape. Our lab is tracking a number of CTI resources worldwide, and what we observe is that, for example, feeds can drastically over or underrepresent sightings in certain geographical regions. Take a look visually at these two images here. What these figures show is that the geographical distribution of indicators across a variety of feeds, and each vertical column is a feed. The colors represent a particular country, and you already see visually that the distribution heavily differs per resource. There are some feeds which place a strong focus on some countries which are barely mentioned by others. So what information is reported and analyzed is also a conscious selection, and we must be aware that this could be biased. The authors of the first paper here looked at what kind of threats cybersecurity firms reported based on their analysis, and they find that high-end threats to high-profile victims are prioritized in commercial reporting, while threats to civil society or using different attack vectors are underrepresented. They also see that commercial reporting attributes the vast majority, they say 88% of targeted threats to civil society, to United States key strategic competitors. So if you buy from a US vendor, this will therefore prominently cover different countries than if you buy CTI from Russia or China. There's often a connotation in the CTI community that there's a lot of redundant information. Actually, the opposite is true, and that is a problem. As I said earlier, the open source and commercial feeds we analyzed, there's almost no overlap, even if they're tracking the same kinds of threats. This is, however, a sign of insufficient coverage, because if they are covering the same actor, why would they not be largely identical? This means that we are probably having significant coverage issues in our assessment of the threat landscape and could be missing a lot of activity we should care about. What can we learn from it? When you consume data into your analysis process, take a critical look at what you get in. Look into the data you get via feeds, compare it to the footprint of your organization and how this aligns between your different data sources and your needs. And be aware of potential bias or focus in that matter in your data and account for it in your analysis.
Now, this is another example that might help you a bit to account for bias in your own ingestion, which is really looking at sharing relationships and other types of partnerships between vendors. That's what this author has done. By analyzing the different types of relationships between vendors, he shows how different clusters of vendors exist. Now, Of course, CTI is a fast-moving field, and his paper is already 3 years old, but his analysis shows how you can account for bias in your own CTI and how picking from one cluster versus another might benefit your CTI and decrease bias. So, based on a discussion of the challenges, you could argue that too much of what we currently do in CTI is still a black box. We know its inputs and we also know its outputs, but its inner workings are unclear, at times at least. This is partly due to the fact, of course, that CTI analysis is an inherently complex field. But if we're structuring and standardizing our outputs and all of our inputs using all of the great taxonomies and frameworks we have come up with, why won't we standardize and model the stuff that happens in between? That is our analysis and our own analyst algorithms. So as we move towards the end of this presentation, we would like to shortly discuss what we're doing as a lab in order to improve on this, but also what you can do in your daily practice to improve on this.
So we believe that there's a number of activities we should work on as a community, and many of these things that are already going on in our lab. If we want to improve something, we first need to be able to objectively measure it. This requires metrics, and we think we need to come to the point that we can confidently quantify our inputs and generated products. We also need to get a better understanding of how much coverage our tools, systems, and feeds provide us with, also with respect to threat landscape and what is relevant for us. Let's talk about intelligence sharing. We know from reports in our research that threat actors share their techniques and tools, and we as defenders can only be effective if we also share. We can improve sharing by utilizing what we know already about incentives and some of the root barriers to sharing. So if we use technological solutions such as privacy enhancing technology to address some of them, we can solve these problems. For instance, we have developed in our lab some protocols where you can compare indicators with external parties and provide a provable guarantee that not reveal to outside what your indicators are and what you're querying in the databases. Analysis techniques are at the core of our trade. We think that as a community, we need to do more research into how we can improve and harden them. And we need to move towards standardized best practices in how we conduct analysis. And with such improvements, we can then also more efficiently leverage what AI might offer us to deal with the heaps of data that we deal with. For example, in our lab, we're working on AI-based recognition and extraction of TTPs from network data. We also need to improve how we work with data. Taxonomies such as ATT&CK are fantastic tools to structure and formalize our discussion around TTPs, but we need additional and commonly used classification schemes for all of the other types of data that we work in CTI with. We also need to improve with respect to structuring and marking our data, including context, sourcing, etc. So what can you do today to improve your CTI? Understand your bubbles. We have seen that there's hardly any overlap between data from different vendors, and feeds have very diverse coverage. This can be good if you're looking for focus, but if you aim for a wide coverage of the threat landscape, it is a bias that you need to be aware of, measure it, and correct for it in your operation.
And then over the course of this presentation, we've shown you various examples of how to perform data analysis in order to get metrics and vet your own CTI. You can look up the articles to replicate this for yourself and to get an idea of potentially useful insight for you. But what we, however, cannot give you are guidelines on how to consider such outcomes. These are highly dependent on your own threat landscape, which is based on your own IT and OT asset landscape. This is dependent on your own threat landscape, which is dependent on your IT and OT and asset landscape. So therefore, only you can define what means quality to you, right?
Study your failures and successes. We have shown that data quality is somewhat of a mixed bag in practice. You can't rely on data to be timely to stop attacks. But even worse, there's a risk for major collateral damage. This means you can't directly apply input data to your controls, and to understand the risk better, you should make it a habit to analyze the false positive in your data to better react to it. Finally, investigate what information is not provided to you. The unknowns are why you actually consume CTI. Understand and quantify the false negatives gap you have.
And then as you share analysis with your community, only use common and established terminology. If you want to disseminate your analysis and assessments to whatever relevant party, leave as limited room for interpretation as possible. We have already too much on our plates, so put in really the extra mile to make it useful to whatever stakeholder you're catering to. Also, share uncertainties and potential gray areas in your analysis, as well as reasoning used to come to certain conclusions. Because only then others know how to estimate your estimates.
Now, talking about sharing. Intelligence sharing is a great tool and a key element to the success for our community, but frequently it does not reach the full potential. We can, however, understand why it is held back. And for example, using better technology, such as pets or collaborative dashboards, or better processes in building communities, you can lead your community to a success. So thank you for your attention. We hope this was useful. If you're interested in what we have talked today about, you can find the paper under the link above. If you'd like to know more about what we do in the lab, have a look at our lab's website below. We publish our reporting and methodology freely there for download. Thank you very much, and we look forward to your questions.